Well, welcome. Today we're going to take a look at Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 20. Just a few verses, but there's a lot packed into these few verses that we want to take a look at and some understanding that we want to gain from this passage. As we go into the study of these few verses, we have a little background we want to share, some things that we want to be thinking about as we move into this process, as we move into the study of these scriptures. The first thing that we want to understand as we look at this is this concept of the bad news must come before the good news. Now, I'm saying that from my perspective because that's how I operate. I always live in the perspective that if someone says, hey, I've got good news and bad news, I always say, give me the bad news first, because that bad news will make the good news even that much better. Whereas if you start with the good news, then it's just going downhill. It's kind of like that concept of the car salesman. When you go in for a specific kind of car, the car salesman will always direct you towards the upper model, the more loaded model, and then it seems like what you want is not as good as what that is, and so it has a tendency to push you towards the spending more money for the more features. It's the same way in our life, and so for me, it's just a standard course that if there's bad news and good news, I always ask for the bad news first. So since you're stuck with me leading this study, you're stuck with my stuff. So sharing the bad news must come before the good news, and that's a background that I want to share with you as we go into our passage for today. Also, too, when we take a look at our passage for today, we have to always remember that we are all in need of salvation. Not just a need, but a desperate need of salvation. We have proven that through chapter 1 and through chapter 2 up to this point. In fact, this is the foundation that Paul is trying to build in this part of the letter, is to bring us to that place, to bring the church in Rome to the place where they understand and comprehend the fact that Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, male or female, doesn't matter. We are all in a desperate need of salvation. And so he's been kind of sowing this and weaving this into his message since the beginning of chapter 1. And that's been important for us to understand, because that serves as a background for everything we're talking about. Because again, we're not hearing the letter, we're not reading the letter straight through, we're picking it apart. So things that we studied that you might have heard just a second or two ago, we studied a week or two ago. And so we have a tendency to forget, so we have to be reminded. And so thinking about that reminder, we were reminded that in verses 12 through 16 of chapter 2, Paul was focusing on the Gentiles. So what we studied last week, Paul was dealing with the Gentiles. Again, the reminder, Gentiles are followers of Jesus who do not belong to the nation of Israel. They are not Jewish. This means that they're not blood descendants of Abraham. They're not part of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so these are Gentile followers. These are people who grew up in the Greco-Roman tradition, probably grew up with the understanding of the Greek gods, and now they have made a decision to follow Jesus. And so in verses 12 through 16, Paul focused specifically on the Gentiles. And now this week we're going to move forward, and we're going to take our gaze off of the Gentiles and move over to the Jews. And we're going to take a look at the Jewish followers. We're going to take a look at the members of the nation of Israel and their perspective and some things that Paul wants to highlight for them, which is important. Now, this is important for us also to understand that Paul is a Jew. So Paul knows exactly what he's talking about because he grew up in this tradition. When he's talking about Jewish followers, when he's talking about members of the nation of Israel, he's talking about himself. Now, granted, he was given a ministry to reach out to the Gentiles. That was what Jesus had called him to do, but yet he was doing it from a Jewish perspective. And so he comes to the table with an interesting perspective. He comes to the table with a lot of insight into this. And so it's important for us to hear what he has to say to the Jewish followers, even though you who are watching right now, you might not be a Jewish follower of Jesus. You might not be Jewish in your heritage. You might not be a member of the line of Abraham. And that's okay, because even as Gentiles, it's important for us to understand the perspective, because again, the perspective that we receive or we learn through the Jews also relates to us, because again, through Jesus, we're all the same. Through Jesus, we're all in a desperate need for salvation. Jew or Gentile, white or black, rich or poor, old or young, male or female, doesn't matter. That we're all in a desperate need for salvation. And so this is what Paul is going to start talking about. In these few verses, he's going to be talking specifically to the Jewish followers of Jesus in the church in Rome. So let's go ahead and take a look real quickly here at Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 20. I hope you've opened up your translation. Again, I'll be reading from the New International Version. You're welcome to read from any version that you want. Now, when you listen to this Bible study, when you're studying with me, there might be some different words or some different ways that your translation phrases things, but that's okay, because when it gets right down to it, they all get to the same point. But it's interesting to have different translations at the table because it gives us a different perspective on some things. So this is Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 20. Let's listen to the word of the Lord. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of the knowledge of truth. Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. And so that's where we're going to stop there in verse 20, because again, there's a lot that we need to go over in these verses. And so I want to take this passage over the next couple of weeks and pull it apart in small little chunks so that we can digest it, because it's important for us to understand what Paul is saying. So we're going to take a look at verses 17 and 18 first. We're going to block these off into two verses apiece. So we're going to look at 17, 18, and then 19 and 20. So let's read 17 and 18 again. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law. Okay, so those are the two verses that we're going to take a look at. The first thing that we have to take a look at when we understand this passage is that Paul is outlining 4 privileges in these 2 verses of being Jewish. Yes, there are privileges for being Jewish. If you're not Jewish, like I'm not Jewish, don't worry, don't feel bad. It's not like they're better than us or you're better than them. Remember, it's not an us and them mentality. It's a divine us. We're all together. So this is not saying one is better than the other. It's just merely saying there's things that we have to understand. There's perspectives. And if you're watching this, if you're studying this right now and you are a Gentile, it's important for you to understand the perspective that Paul's talking about from the Jewish perspective. It's important for us to grasp it. So this is why we're going to take a look at it. So we're going to look at 4 privileges of being Jewish. So the first privilege we look at is the privilege of relying on the law. Now look at this. It says, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law. If you rely on the law. Now again, your translations might have some different words. The NIV says rely on the law. But you understand what it's saying. There's this special revelation that the Jews have received. And that is called the law. And the law is something that we're going to be talking a lot about today. This concept of the law and the relationship with God that it builds. And so the relying on the law is this special revelation that Jewish people have received. A special revelation that Gentile people did not receive. The Jewish people are God's chosen people. The descendants of Abraham are God's chosen people. And throughout history, that's been the relationship that God has had. It wasn't until after the death and resurrection of Jesus that really the good news of God, the salvation of God, was opened up for all the rest of the world, the Gentile world. But up to that point, it was really a special revelation just specifically for the Jewish people. So that first privilege that we see in verses 17, 18 is to rely on the law, that special privilege that Jews have received. Now, let's take a look at the law and let's understand the dimensions of the law. First thing that we have to understand about the law is that there are 3 sections of the Jewish law. Now, when I say Jewish law, I'm kind of referring to what we would call as believers in Christ as the Old Testament. And so the law goes through the Old Testament. You see it in the history of the Jewish people. And so there are 3 broad sections. Again, this is painting with broad strokes. The first section is the moral law. And this is a direction to the Jewish people of how to live. So the moral law is how a Jew is to live in the world, to live with each other, to live in relationship with other people, to live in relationship with the world. This is the moral law. This is the do's and the don'ts, the behaviors that you are to do and the behaviors that you're supposed to avoid. This is the moral law. The second section is called ceremonial law. You'll find this in the Old Testament. And that is how a Jew is to worship and to approach God. And it's very important for us to understand that in the law, there were very specific rules and regulations for how a Jewish person was supposed to worship and how a Jewish person approaches God. And so that comes under the umbrella of the ceremonial law. Different than the moral law, but it's still a law from God. It's still a revelation from God. And the third section is the civil law. So we have the moral law, we have the ceremonial law, and then we have the civil law. And the civil law is how a Jew is to function in society. How a Jew is to function in society. And this is important for us to remember, because if you remember where the law came from the Exodus story. So basically, to paint again in broad strokes, you had the nation of Israel, you had the Hebrew people, you had the descendants of Abraham who were slaves in Egypt. And they had been slaves in Egypt for roughly about 400 years or so. And so think about that. Think about that compared like to the age of America. It's like twice as old as America is. And so for twice as long as America has been in existence, the Hebrew people were slaves in Egypt. And so being a slave had become a part of their identity. The Hebrew people in Israel were just used to, they just expected, the way that they lived is that when they got up in the morning, from the moment they got up until they went to sleep, they were told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. They were controlled by someone else. And then all of a sudden we have the Exodus story where Moses comes and demands the release of the captives, and finally, after all of the plagues, then Pharaoh lets them go, and they go out and they cross the Red Sea, and they start making their way towards the Holy Land. And so they're on this pilgrimage. Well, now you've got a million people who have lived for 400 years as slaves, now find themselves free, and these million people have to function as a society. So what did God do? God gave them the civil law. God gave them how a Jew is to function in society. How are we to live with each other? How do we make decisions? What's right and what's wrong? What's against the law? What is not against the law? And so you have the civil aspect of the law. So those three aspects are very important for us to understand when we're talking about the law today. And that is that you've got the moral law, you've got the ceremonial law, and then you've got the civil law. And those are the three aspects of the law that God has given to the Jewish people. This is the background, the foundation of the people who are sitting in the church in Rome who claim to be Jewish, who claim that lineage and being a descendant of Abraham. They bring all of this to the table. Again, as we've talked about many times before in our relationship with Jesus Christ, we cannot prevent ourselves from coming to the table fully as ourselves. We can come to the table understanding that we're transformed. We can come to the table understanding that we're following a new way, but we can't come to the table without bringing ourselves. And so we bring our stuff. And so the Jewish Christians in Rome have brought their stuff, and part of their stuff that they brought is the law. And it's important for them to understand the ramifications of that, and it's important for their Gentile brothers and sisters to understand the ramifications of that, because it's going to affect their relationship. It's going to affect how the church works. It's going to affect how they're going to understand God. It's going to affect how they're going to understand Jesus. It's going to affect how they understand the Holy Spirit. It's going to affect everything. And that's important for them to focus on. Again, remember, we're just focusing on the Jewish Christians in Rome right now. Last week, it was the Gentile Christians. This week is the Jewish Christians. So let's go ahead and continue, and now that we've had a little introduction to the law, with that second privilege. And so the second privilege we see in God in verse 17 is to boast in God. Listen to the words again. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God. Boast in God. So basically what Paul's talking about here is that Jews can claim a special relationship with God. You know, a Jew can stand up and say, I know God and God knows me. Not that that's not true for everybody in the world, but specifically for the Jewish people, this is essential to understand that there's this boasting, this claim of a special relationship. And that's not lying. That is not boasting in a negative or a bad way. It's basically saying, look at history. Look at history. Ever since Abraham and Sarah, we have been God's chosen people. We have had a special relationship with God. And it's significant, it's important. So what Paul is saying here, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, So the second privilege is this boasting in God, having this special relationship with God. When we move on to the third privilege we get into verse 18, and that is you know his will. Listen to the word. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will. So going down through history, Jews know the will of God. Now again, we have seen, because Jews are human beings just like we are, you don't always follow the will of God. But that doesn't change the fact that they know the will of God. How do they know the will of God? They've got the story, what we call the Old Testament. They've got the whole story of God working in the midst of his people, God working in the midst of the nation of Israel, God working in the midst of the family of Abraham. That God is there and God has been working and been doing miraculous things, teaching lessons and performing miracles. And so there's this understanding of the will of God. And also, too, down through that history, God has shared the law with the Jewish people. God has shared the moral law, the ceremonial law, the civil law. So there's all of this understanding of the expectations of God for his people. And so there is the knowing of this will. If you know his will, and that is, again, going back to verse 17 when he says, if you claim to be a Jew, then you rely on the law, you boast in God, and you know his will. So that's the third privilege. So let's move on to the fourth privilege. The fourth privilege continues on in that verse, and it's approve of what is superior. So now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior, because you are instructed by the law. And so this is this understanding that the Jews approve of what is the law. So not only is the law being given to the Jewish people, but history has proven out that they accept that law. They receive that law. They take that law in. They try to follow that law. They try to be a people that are of that law. And so it's not just receiving something. It's not just saying I got a special relationship, but it's also reciprocal. It's turning around and the Jews are, through their actions, approving of that law, saying, I'm going to follow it. I'm going to do my best to be the person that God is wanting me to be based on what I'm learning about God and about myself through the law. And so this is approving of what is superior, as it says here in the word. You know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law. Because you've gotten this instruction, because you have this special revelation, you have this special relationship with God, you know God's will, then you are standing up in response to that and you're approving by trying to keep it, trying to follow that. And so he's kind of set up these four privileges in verses 17 and 18. And that leads us to verses 19 and 20. So let's take a look at our passages here. So picking up in verse 19. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of the knowledge of truth. Now notice in these four verses that we're looking at for today, everything is if. It's kind of posed in a question. So if you claim to be a Jew, if you claim to be a follower of God through the nation of Israel, if you claim to be a descendant of Abraham, then all of these things are the case. You've got the four privileges, but now you're taking a look at, and Paul is going to outline four practices of the Jewish people. So we've got the privileges that we just shared, but now we've got the practices that are going into it. And both of these two verse little subtext start with the word if. Listen to verse 17. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law. Now verse 19, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor for the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. So it's all these ifs. And that if is one of those words that says, well, if you claim this, then this is what follows. So if you say you're a follower of God, this is what that looks like then. And so he's saying, if you're claiming the Jewish title, if you're claiming that special relationship, if you're claiming that blood lineage back to Abraham, a child of God, a member of the nation of Israel, then this is what it's going to look like. These are the four practices that you're going to be living out in your life. And these are the four practices, not just of the Jewish Christians in Rome, but these are the four practices of the Jewish people. Since the beginning of time, these are the four practices of the Jewish people. Now, remember, and just place this in your head as we're going over this. Us human beings mess things up all the time. We take something very simple and we make it very complicated. And since the beginning of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, there has been a focus that God has had. There's been a goal that God has had. And unfortunately, all the way up into Jesus' time, the Jews kind of were missing the mark because they had gone their own way. They had started to add a lot of stuff to it that God didn't initially add. There started to be problems because they stopped understanding or stopped living into the original intention. And that's always the hardest thing for us humans to do. We're very good at starting something, but we're not very good at over time keeping true to the true intention. To the original intention. And that's where the Jews are struggling. And this is one of the lessons that Paul wants to share with the Jewish Christians, and Paul wants to share with the Gentile Christians in the church in Rome. And these 4 practices are very important for us to understand as foundational principles for why God picked, why God selected, why God carved out his people of the descendants of Abraham. They had a specific purpose. It wasn't because he liked them better. It wasn't because they were better. It was simply because there was a specific purpose. And the specific purpose had to be carried out by someone. And so he chose these people, the chosen people, the Jews, to carry these things out. Now we'll see, and we can talk about as we go through this process, how have they done. But right now, it's just to understand these practices. So the first practice that we're going to take a look at is guide for the blind. Look at verse 19. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, again, speaking to the Jewish Christians in Rome, if you're convinced that you're a guide to the blind, and so the blind in this passage, it references those who are without the law. Those who are without the law. Now again, it's not their fault that they're blind. It's not, because they did something wrong that they're blind. It's just simply because they can't see. If you don't have sight, you can't see. Regardless of how hard you try, regardless of how hard you want to, you can't see. Now again, last week we talked about the fact that there's this conscience that God has given each one of us, and so deep down each one of us knows right from wrong, good from bad. But as far as the specifics of the law, again, the 3 aspects of the law, the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the civil law, the people outside of the nation of Israel, the people outside of the Jewish people are blind. And so the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, are to be guides to the blind. Listen to those words again. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a guide for the blind. And the blind is basically you and me as Gentile followers, those of us who did not have the law, those of us who did not have the privilege of all of those generations of relationship with God. Not knowing the will of God, not understanding the complexities of God, not understanding really how to approach God or the understanding of the nature of God. And that makes us blind. And so as in this relationship, the Jewish people were to be called to be guides to the blind. They are to be people who help those or to connect with those who are without the law. So that's the first practice. Second practice we're going to take a look at is a light for those who are in the dark. Listen to this verse again in verse 19. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, comma, a light for those who are in the dark. A light for those who are in the dark. Again, those without the law. Those who are blind are people who find themselves in the dark. And I put in here a little parentheses, Jonah, because some of you were with us for the study of Jonah that we did right before Romans. And we've got to be reminded of that story. Remember Jonah's purpose. Jonah was a member of the nation of Israel. He was a Jew. He was a descendant of Abraham. And God came to Jonah and said to Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. And I want you to preach against Nineveh because I've seen the wickedness of their way. So basically what Jonah was commissioned by God to do was go to Nineveh and to preach a message of repentance. Change your ways now because you're living the wrong way. But Jonah didn't want to do that. Why didn't Jonah want to do it? Number one, Jonah didn't want to do it because the Ninevites were Gentiles. They were not members of the nation of Israel. And number two, he didn't like the Ninevites. And so we talked about that in our study of Jonah, about the fact that Jonah ran away, not from God, he ran away from the Ninevites because he didn't want to go to the Ninevites because he knew if he went to the Ninevites because God wanted him to, and he preached repentance to them, they would repent and they would be forgiven by God. And he didn't want them to be forgiven by God, number one, because they weren't Jewish, they were outside of the nation of Israel, they were not descendants of Abraham, they were Gentiles, and number two, He felt that they were just horrible people, regardless of their background. He just didn't like them, and so he didn't want them to be saved. And so Jonah forgot this second practice of being a Jewish person. that the Jewish person was called to be a light to those who are in the dark, called to be a guide to those who are blind. And that's the second practice that we take a look in our verses for today. The third practice that we're going to take a look at is instructor of the foolish. Let's listen to the word again. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, verse 20, an instructor of the foolish. An instructor of the foolish. And it makes sense because foolish people need instructed. The foolish the instructor of the people who are foolish. These are people who only have worldly wisdom. They're not fools. They're not stupid. They don't have intelligence. It's just that they lack all of the knowledge. They lack all of the perspective. They lack all of the insight. And so people who only have worldly wisdom, and in this specific context in the church in Rome, we're talking about Greek intellectualism. Because remember, we've talked about the fact that the Gentile Christians in this church in Rome came out of the Greco-Roman tradition of the Greek gods and the philosophers. And all of that is very important. It's very good, and it's wonderful for expanding your mind and expanding understanding and learning things. But also, too, it's incomplete by itself. It's incomplete by itself. So the Jewish people had always had a call to be an instructor of the foolish, to meet people where they are and to give them the insight that they don't have. Not that you're saying, forget all your Greek intellectualism, forget all of your background, but add to it the truth, add to it the good news that we give you, this understanding of the nature of God. Again, the focus is that the relationship that the Jewish people have with God gives them insight into the will of God, the nature of God, how to approach God, how to worship God, how to live together in a community as God's people. And so this is what they are to instruct and to share with the foolish. Again, in this specific context in the church in Rome, the foolish are the Greek intellectualism. It's the Greek intellectuals in the crowd. These are the people who know a lot about Socrates. They know a lot about Plato. They know a lot about the Greek gods. Well, now it's time for them to be instructed in the deeper wisdom of the understanding of God. The deeper wisdom, the understanding of what it means to be a society under God, what it means to be a nation under God, what it means to be people living under God. And so that is what they're supposed to do. That's a third practice as we see here in the passage. An instructor of the foolish. Well, that leads us to our fourth practice, and the fourth practice is teachers of little children. Listen to the word again. An instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children. A teacher of little children. Now, in this passage, we need to understand that this is both representing the fact that we're to teach the children. Teach the children how they shall go, and when they grow old, they shall not depart from it. This is a very standard understanding of any truth. You teach a kid how to live, then when they get older, they're going to revert back to that. Yes, they might have their rebel times when they do something different, but eventually they're going to get back to that place where they learned what they learned as a child. And that's why it's so essential and so important for us as followers of Jesus to make connection with our children, to give them the truth, to share with them the good news of Jesus, to teach them the stories when they're young, so that when they get older and they start to veer away, when they get older and they start to explore, they start to sow their wild oats, there's always that foundation underneath. One of the problems that we have in our culture today in the breakdown of the family in America is the fact that there are children now that are not getting the good news of Jesus. There are children now that are not getting the truth. They're not getting the foundation of a Judeo-Christian perspective on life and on relationships and on the world. And so what happens is they're getting a worldly perspective, like in our passage for this week. They're getting the Greek intellectualism. They're just getting a steady diet of that. And then they get through into their older years and they start to rebel and they start to go different ways and they start to do different things, which is understandable because all human beings do that at some point. We all have to rebel against what we've been taught as a child because we want to see if it's true or not. We want to see if there's a better way or not. Well, when they do that now in this context without the foundation of the good news of Jesus, without the foundation of the understanding of God and the nature of God and how to live as God's people, then once they start to sow their wild oats, they got nothing to come back to. All they can come back to is the worldly way. Well, basically, they haven't left the worldly way. So there's a sense of a spiritual lostness that we find ourselves in our culture today. And I think we can see it very plainly in America, in the breakdown of the family, in the breakdown of the basic understanding of truth, the basic understanding of right and wrong. Not that this is the whole case, but really is a part of the case, is that we dropped the ball as followers of Jesus, and we stopped teaching our children. We stopped raising our children up and knowing the good news, raising our children up and understanding the nature of God, so that when they go out and sow their wild oats, when that time comes to an end, they have something to come back to. Now there's a whole generation or more of people who don't have anything to come back to. They go out and sow their wild oats, and then they turn around and all they got behind them is more wild oats. They don't have anything else. They have nothing to come back to, and they're lost. And then that just gets translated again and again and again, generation after generation. But also, too, in this passage, when it's talking about teachers of little children, this is not just physical, but this is also spiritual children. You can be 80 years old and still be a spiritual child. And not that that's wrong, not that that's bad. It's just a reality. There are some people that are old in years, but young in their relationship with God. They're old in years, but young in their understanding of the nature of God, understanding of the truth of God, their understanding of Scripture. And that's not bad. That's just the reality. And so it's important for the Jewish people, and it's important for us as Gentiles too, to claim this role, to say that we need to be teachers of the little children, both physically and spiritually in our midst. We're supposed to be giving the good news and sharing the good news in many different ways so people can pick up from it, they can glean it, and they can put it into practice in their lives. And this is an essential characteristic of the nation of Israel. This is one of the reasons, one of the 4 practices that God had given the descendants of Abraham to share with the rest of the world. Again, the descendants of Abraham, the chosen people, the Jews, were not chosen, not selected, not separated by God from the rest of the world so that they can be separated from the rest of the world by God. No, they were separated so that they can learn and then go out and be a blessing to others. Go out and be a light to the world. Go out and teach the children, whether physical or spiritual. And so this is an important aspect that Paul is trying to remind the Jewish Christians in Rome, but also too to remind and teach the Gentile Christians, and to bring us to that place where we understand that not only is that their practice, but now that we're all even, remember the beginning of this passage, we started talking about the fact that we're all in desperate need of salvation, we all fall short of the mark, then it's all of our focus. That all these practices now are not just for the Jews, but they're also for the Gentiles. That all followers of Jesus are to follow these practices. And that's why it's important for him to highlight these things. So let's listen again to verses 19 and 20. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. The embodiment of knowledge and truth. And that's where we end today, is that the Jews were meant to be a guide, a light, an example, and a teacher. This was the initial reasoning. If we could go back in time and we could be with God in that place where Abraham and Sarah have been told that they're going to have a child, they're going to have a son, and he is going to be the father of a large nation, and the descendants are going to outnumber the stars in the sky and the sands on the beach. We would understand that in that moment, God's intention was that these people, these descendants of Abraham, were going to be a light for the world. They were going to be a guide, a light, an example, a teacher. That I was going to use this group of people in order to share the good news of me to everyone. That I was going to use these people as an example of how to live for everyone. I was going to use these people as an example for the world. And that was the initial intention of the Jewish people. But just like us human beings do, over time we lose sight of that initial intention. And by the time we get to Jonah, by the time we get to Jesus, we are at this place where the Jewish people are all about themselves. This concept that we've heard a lot about lately, this concept of nationalism, that it's all about us first. And so there's this understanding within the nation of Israel, within the Jewish people in Jesus' day and Paul's day, that it's all about us, that we are special, that we are privileged, that we are blessed, and we need to enjoy that, and we can't share that with anybody else, or we can't let anybody else in, which is totally counter to God's initial and original intention for the members of the nation of Israel, for the descendants of Abraham, because the Jewish people are called to be a guide, a light, an example, and a teacher. That's who the Jewish people are to be to all of us. But yet, it didn't happen that way. And again, I'm not shaking my finger at the Jewish people, because if you would have picked another group of people, if God would have selected, instead of Abraham and Sarah, God would have selected Timothy and Jane and created a nation out of them, their descendants would have lost sight of the original goal too, because as human beings, again, left to our own devices, we will mess things up. And so this is what Paul is again talking about. Last week, he was focusing on the Gentiles. Now, if we were reading this straight, it just would have been a few seconds ago. He was focusing on the Gentiles, saying you don't have the law, but whenever you act as the law teaches, then you have a law written in your heart. You have this consciousness inside of you that lets you know what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. And when you follow that, then you are following the law just as a member of the nation of Israel follows the law. And then he turns around and takes the spotlight off the Gentiles and focuses it right on the Jews for this passage that we're looking at this week. Again, it would have just been a second ago, but he's looking at the Jews now and saying, oh, and by the way, for you have some things you need to deal with too. And that's important for them to understand. And so that's where we're going to leave off today. We're going to pick up in verse 21 next week, and we're going to continue in this conversation about the understanding of the responsibility. And when we talk about the understanding or the responsibility of a specific group of people, whether they're Jew or Gentile, again, as followers of Jesus, when we filter everything through that filter and that understanding, is that we're talking about all of us. We might be using Jews as an example. We might be using Gentiles as an example. We might be using this sin as an example. We might be using that action as an example. But really, it's overarching, and it covers us all. And we must remember that. And so this week, we focused in specifically on the Jewish people and their responsibility and their practices and their benefits that they have. And so as we move forward, we're going to continue to take a look at these things, but more as bringing us together, again, under that umbrella of the fact that we are all sinners, that we all fall short of the mark, that we all need the salvation that is given to us through Jesus. We all need the grace of God that is given to us through Jesus Christ. And we'll see that as we continue on in the book of Romans. So, until then, I pray that you stay safe, that you stay sane. Again, as I have said before, if you have found a blessing in this study, please share it with somebody else. There just might be something in here that someone else needs to hear or someone else needs to study. So please feel free to share this with anybody and everyone. So until we get back together again next week, I pray you have a wonderful week. We'll see you soon.